It's Fresh Start Sunday here at your Breath of Life.
And it's second Sunday. You know what that means. It's Couple Sunday. So if you're a couple that's intent on thriving and not just surviving, you're in the right place.
You know, last month we actually talked to some dating people that were talking about deal breakers when it comes to relationship. This month we are back with our couples, and today the discussion is boundaries. But before we kick it back to the Snells, we want to start off with a 90-second parable.
Are you sure this is going to work?
Well, I mean, we both wrote our points down, so I think so.
Absolutely not.
Oh, come on.
No,
you barely even looked at it.
You didn't even see my side of you. Like, you didn't even try. Did you even try?
There's no way you're not doing this on purpose.
No.
Did you even look at it?
No, you're ignoring absolute facts. Anyone in the world would agree with me.
Listen. You're not even arguing with real science.
I am, though.
No, you're
am
not.
I?
You're arguing with emotion. How am I supposed to logic with emotion?
With facts?
I'm pretty sure I am.
No, anyone. Who raised you?
What do you mean who raised me?
This is caveman logic.
This is
Are
not
you willing to die on this hill just because of what your mom said?
You've been going on about this.
What your mom did?
Don't bring
her into this.
Don't bring her into this.
I am bringing her into
How are you going to argue against science?
It's legit a meme.
It's
It's
not on
an
Wikipedia.
actual meme.
You're not going to. It's literally
It's
science.
a meme.
It's been proven.
It is a meme.
It's a
okay.
scholar.
Yeah.
You can't
You're
argue
proving
this
my point.
Cold hard fact.
It is a meme.
How are you going to argue
Oh my
this?
gosh. You know what? So we're at an impasse.
I mean, what else is there to do? Or we could always just put it on the rack like that.
Okay. So we're living in the dark ages.
Oh my goodness.
Wow, that is why boundaries are definitely important.
Well, we're not going to delay any longer. So over to you, Snells.
Thank you so much, PJ and Danita, for the assist. This is Pastor Snell, and I'm so excited to be joined by my gorgeous, amazing wife, Gianna. Gianna, you want to say hello to the people?
Yes. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us again for another point of view. We're excited that you joined us, and I'm happy to be here with you, baby.
Listen, we're going to get right into it today. Listen, on point of view, we don't run from the hard conversations. We run right toward them. So today, we're going to be discussing the issue of boundaries in marriage. How do you establish them? Do we even need them? So we're going to have a little time talking about it. I think, Gianna, you had some thoughts you wanted to share with us to get us off the ground.
Yeah, so I was actually reading this story about a couple who was obsessed with volcanoes, and they were trying to capture them, trying to video them, take pictures of them, like they made it their life's passion to study and get close to volcanoes.
Okay.
And with their own words, they said, we're probably pushing the boundaries here.
Okay.
Like, we're probably getting a little too close. But they couldn't help it. Like, they were obsessed.
Yeah.
And one day they went to go study an eruption that happened over in Japan.
Okay.
They got really close as they had ever been, and they were hiding under a ridge.
Wow.
But unfortunately, some of that lava came down and ultimately killed them because they kept crossing boundaries. They kept getting too close to danger and to the edge. And ultimately what boundaries are there for are to protect us from harm.
Sure.
They're there to keep us safe. And sometimes when we talk about boundaries in marriage, we feel like, oh, I got to follow a rule. They're trying to control me. But when we really look deeper at what boundaries are there for, they're there to protect us.
Sure.
And I think a lot of times when we think back to what you do every 4th of July, you give us a awesome home fireworks show.
I am the fireworks
you
guy.
are the firework man.
All right.
And I love what you do in that you always kind of show us the line like, hey guys, you all, I want you to get a good close seat, but don't cross this line because when those sparks fly and when the heat comes, you don't want us to get burned.
Yeah.
And so those boundaries are there to protect us. We want to get close, but we got to stay outside of those boundaries.
Yeah. And it's funny because like sometimes we hear that word and it automatically connotes for some of us restriction.
Right.
But do you realize that actually, man, when God first created marriage, one of the first things he did was actually he created a boundary, even as it relates to how newly formed husband and wife relate to mom and dad.
Yeah.
He said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother's house and be joined to his wife.
Yeah.
So that in terms of proximity, location, he was supposed to, put a boundary.
Right.
Not necessarily abandon.
Right.
Not necessarily avoid.
Yeah.
Kind of have a boundary between even him and his parents.
Absolutely,
for the flourishing and the development of the marriage.
Absolutely. And then even when you think about just boundaries with our children, ultimately we want to protect our marriage, right? And when we have children, sometimes
we have opposition.
that thing gets real,
Yeah.
You're trying to protect your marriage, you're trying to protect your intimacy, your communication.
Yeah.
And sometimes children can just kind of come in and they want to sleep in your bed and they want to interrupt all the conversations.
Yeah.
They want everything, and when they're infants, everything
Sure.
is about them. But as they get older, I
Right.
think it's healthy to create those boundaries and say, hey, it's time for you to go to your bedroom now.
Yeah.
Hey, it's time for mommy and daddy to have their time.
Yeah.
And boundaries doesn't mean that the person outside of them is an enemy.
Right.
It's just protecting
Yeah.
what we long to thrive. Like we want to see this thing thrive, so there has to be some structure.
Yeah. So let's get into it and maybe
Okay.
just share a few thoughts,
Yeah.
maybe a few ideals, kind of with our audience about the importance of boundaries, why they matter, or maybe just some critical elements. Did you want to jump off into something maybe for the ladies or even for the couples? Just a boundary principle.
Okay. So the first thing is just communication. A lot of times as women, sometimes we expect our partners to know,
Right.
to guess, to feel, to automatically understand what our boundaries are. But it's so important to communicate and not just have that expectation. He should know this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right.
I love my man, but sometimes there are things that are just not always, just right there. Just right there. Am I right?
No, you're correct. Yeah, I mean,
Right.
that's why you need to kind of
Yeah.
stay in communication so that
Right.
you maintain a sense of synergy, a oneness, because you can
Yeah.
kind of experience drift if you're not in constant communication.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It keeps the intimacy going. It keeps the communication going. We have to constantly be willing to communicate what those boundaries are.
Yeah.
Because otherwise the other person just doesn't know. And as people, we bring baggage into our marriages. We bring trauma. We bring different triggers into our marriages. And where one person may do things one way, it could be triggering, or it could be, kind of something that, even though it may not be harmful in and of itself, it's something that triggers the other person.
Sure.
So, like, for instance, some people, are like, hey, one of my boundaries is, please don't raise your voice.
Sure.
Like, that's just a no for me. Whereas the other person's like, hey, this is just how we talk in our family. We're just loud.
So she's talking about us. I get very excited. My decibel can elevate.
Yes,
And that's actually
yes.
something I had to adjust. And
Right.
that was a wide turn.
Yeah.
But to be able to make sure I communicate in a way that even
Yeah.
though this was loving conversation to me, it communicated something different to you.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Because, I'm a very soft-spoken person. I'm very calm, easygoing. And so that's just how I vibe.
Yeah.
That's how I communicate. And so, that was something that was a boundary, and we were able to talk through it and work through it, and it, it works out well.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a thought I want to share in terms of like boundaries. I think boundaries have to be established together. It has to be a joint effort. So it's not, husband is giving wife a boundary.
Right.
Wife is not giving husband a boundary. Like these are an agreed upon set of principles that we're going to both embrace and enthusiastically place around our marriage for its protection and its wholeness.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think is critical in this thing about boundaries is boundaries they only work in an environment of trust. Because
that's
where
good.
there is no trust, the boundary feels like a leash
Right.
that restricts, as opposed to a guardrail that keeps you from actually going over a cliff.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of be one of those things where we both kind of sit down together and say, okay, as the Snells or as the Johnsons or as the Smiths or whatever it is, these are the things that we agree on. We form a covenant with one another to put these things in place to safeguard our marriage. And I think, part of it is just recognizing, using the story you shared at the beginning, even the Bible talks about, a man can't take fire into his bosom and not be burned. Wow. So that there is something about that principle of proximity that says, okay, if I get too close to a certain scenario, predicament, the outcome is going to be destruction. I preached a sermon here recently about Adam and Eve, partaking of the forbidden fruit.
Yeah.
And it's funny because one of the things one of my favorite authors talks about is how, Satan wasn't able to just go around the garden, following them with temptation. He couldn't walk around the garden and say, eat the fruit, eat the fruit. He could only have access to them when they came toward the tree. And see, so I need you to know, that final step to eat the fruit was already decided when they made that first step toward the tree.
Yeah.
So if they don't even get in proximity, they don't even engage, they don't even entertain certain things. And so there is power in maintaining a certain amount of proximity.
That's really good. And I think we were talking earlier about sometimes in relationships, you find couples or partners who are trying to see how close they can get to something without getting burned. You know, they get close to their ex, they get close to something they were addicted to, they get close to, something in the DMs. And, a lot of times we're just like, oh, I was just, da-da-da. But no, if you get too close and if you keep pushing that boundary, you're gonna get burned. You're gonna go past the point where you're able to resist. And so it's important to have those boundaries to say here and no further,
And the truth is, most people don't set out to do that. You may have a small portion of just truly grimy people who just like, man, this is what I do, right? But for most people, they kind of find themselves ensnared, caught up. Simply because they didn't kind of recognize certain boundaries.
Absolutely. And that's why it's important that we continue to maintain our individual wholeness, because when we are feeling like there's an unmet need or when we're feeling like there's a hole in our relationship, those are the moments where we're extra vulnerable. And so we have to keep those boundaries high, know what our boundaries are, know what our weaknesses are, and continue to kind of keep that strong.
That's a good word. All right.
The other thing I wanted to share was just knowing that everybody's boundaries may not be the same. And I'm saying that because sometimes we set boundaries based on a priority that our relationship has. So for instance, right now, one of our priorities is being there for our children, making sure that we have adequate family time. And so one of our boundaries right now is just not taking on excess amounts of work, saying no to certain things. There are boundaries around our family time because that's what we are prioritizing right now. And sometimes we may look and see, oh, she's out here, living her best life, or he's out here doing this. And we may say, well, I should be able to do that. But you have to look back at what your priority is, what your family is.
Don't negotiate your priorities
based on what everybody else is doing. Because we hear about other people's priorities and other people's boundaries, and we may say, girl, why can't you go on that trip? Or why can't you, take that extra job? But we don't know what their priorities are in their home. They may be working on healing for their marriage, healing for their family, healing. They may be taking care of older parents. We just don't know. And so it's important that even as we're setting up and communicating boundaries for our marriage, that we're not comparing and contrasting what other people are doing, but setting our boundaries based on what our priorities are.
So I think probably the last thing I'll probably throw out before we bring in our panel, because we have an excellent panel. Let's go help us kind of chop it up and break it down a little bit. Is one of the reasons I think we have boundaries is not just for predators, outside enemies, because there are a lot of things that can actually happen involuntarily. So that, man, when we get too close, there are certain things that you can't account for. You can't see it coming. Certain things like chemistry, attraction. Sometimes people, they just, they may have something in them that calls out to something in you, and it's not something that you're looking for. It's an involuntary reflex. But I think, again, you can't necessarily control that. But again, you can control your proximity, your space. And even there's a boundary You know, it's even the energy you put out into the world. Because there are times where, you know, sometimes a person who is married can put out an energy that says, I'm available, that I'm accessible, right? So whether you have on a ring or not, if your energy, you know, doesn't say taken, closed, off the market, you have a way of kind of inviting conversation, a dialogue, a comfort, a familiarity. So I think that's one of the other reasons we have boundaries, simply because, you know, there are involuntary energies that happen that can kind of draw us in, you know, make you feel wanted, make you feel desired, you know, make you feel flattered, and it can kind of push you in the wrong direction.
Right. And that's why it's so important that we keep those boundaries, not only physically and in the outer realm, but even in our minds and our hearts. You know, we got to rein in our minds. We got to rein in our hearts, our souls, because sometimes we're just like, oh yeah, I would never do that. But in your mind, you've already gone there. And so it's important that the boundaries are not only set up outside, but in our minds, because that's where it all starts.
Yeah, that's it.
And so it's just, boundaries are just, they're necessary.
They're necessary.
Yeah.
So listen, we just want to throw a few things out there for consideration, just to kind of give you something to chew on. But right now, we're going to get ready to transition. We got an amazing wives panel. We got a husbands panel. We're going to kind of look at it through the male eye, through the female eye. And hopefully we can kind of help, you know, you settle some things, come to some conclusions, or maybe just give some things that are fertilizer for thought, so that you can increase, that you'll be able to create a space within your marriage. You can set a paradigm and an order for your home that works for you and blesses you in the long term. So we look forward to seeing you back in just a minute.
We always love when the Snells open up with a great conversation starter. And now I'm here with these amazing ladies on the panel, Nicole and Gianna. And here's a thing that I noticed when you all were talking in the beginning about boundaries, is that I realized that to some people, just the word might actually turn them off, when really it is very healthy for couples to have that. What would you say to a person that immediately, when they have like an immediate reaction to like, oh, no, I don't want boundaries, I don't want anybody telling me what I can do? What would you say to them about that?
Well, basically, what I would tell them, you have to have boundaries. You need to have boundaries in a marriage. Friendships have boundaries. And so in a marriage, in order to survive, you have to have those boundaries and not look at it as if your independence is taken away. But I do think as when you're married earlier on, sometimes as you're growing into the relationship, the marriage, you might have those fears of my independence is being taken away. But as we grow in Christ and grow in our marriages, that should eventually change. So not looking at it as something that, you know, we just cannot do, but this is for the sanction of our marriage is very important.
So I know, Gianna, you and your husband were talking about some great boundaries that you've just kind of loosely defined for us. Was that something that you all learned? Was that advice that you were given by some maybe healthy married people that was like, this is something that you need? Because obviously you have a healthy definition, and I think we all do. Was that something that someone said, this is a good idea to start off this way?
I definitely remember just getting a lot of counsel, because I'm a pastor's wife, you know, we're a pastoral couple. There were certain boundaries that, you know, our parents told us, and even in our premarital counseling about, you know, surrounding the opposite sex, because being in ministry, you have to minister to people and be there and show up for them. But it was something that was, you know, given to us as counsel. We learned through, you know, just discussing what those boundaries were, what we felt comfortable with. And so it definitely helped to have those boundaries in place, so that I can have the freedom to know that when he comes home at 8 p.m., I'm not terrified. I know that the boundaries are in place, and that if he did have to go visit someone, that he took the elder with him or a team with him. Like, those boundaries give us that freedom. Like, I love what you said about being able to operate in your marriage and be able to be free. There was a study done where there was some children that were playing, and they let them play without a fence, and they were terrified to play. Like, they were just kept themselves in the center. They didn't have the freedom to roam. They didn't have the freedom to really enjoy themselves. And then they built a fence around the children. and they were just roaming around being free. You know, they were able to close their eyes, they were able to soar, they were able to explore every inch of the yard because they knew that they were protected by that boundary of the fence. And I think it's the same thing in marriage. Like when we have those boundaries, when we know what we expect of each other, when we know what we're going to control within our own boundaries, it gives us that freedom to operate individually, but still know that we're protected, that we're protecting what we've been building for so long, what we want to, you know, this marriage to thrive. We got to protect it and give it that structure.
And that's an awesome thing to do. And I know a lot of times people kind of try to incorporate like, oh, boundaries when it comes to the opposite sex, but it could be something as small as, like you all mentioned earlier, how we argue, how we bring up points, what is necessary for the other person, what makes me comfortable in having conversations. But there's one that I think you brought up that I actually like the most. And it was actually something that I saw growing up in my parents' marriage. They had boundaries when it came to the children. And it was something as small as, like, my dad was like, look, when we're sitting in church, you don't get to sit between me and your mother. You have to sit on one side or the other. And people thought that was silly. Like, how can you have boundaries with your kids? I always want to be available. But I'd love for us to just kind of touch on why it's important for couples to even have boundaries with their own kids, to kind of like dive in a little bit more with that.
Right. Well, with our kids, we do have boundaries as well. They still come into our room. But one of the things that my husband always was very proactive with is if one of the kids got a little disrespectful, or he was like, are you being disrespectful to my wife? That's not your mom now, that's my wife. And we're not gonna have that in this household. So I was always appreciative of him, making sure that he, you know, talk to the kids about that if they stepped out of line. And so it can be boundaries and discipline, you know, boundaries and different things, but mainly, you know, my husband, he was really good about letting them know you're not going to disrespect my wife.
What about you, Gianna? What are some great boundaries that the children are learning with you and your husband as a couple?
I think one thing that's been important for us, as much as it's important to take a family vacation, we're learning that we need to take a vacation, you know, just the two of us.
Vacation, I love that.
Yes, and that's something we just started doing here recently. And it's so funny, the kids are like, wait, you're going without us? Like, what are you going to do without us, you know? Like, and we always have to tell them, like, we were here before you all, and we want that to continue, you know? And I think ultimately the goal is to build a strong marriage and keep that at the forefront, so that we can, out of that overflow of a strong marriage, we can pour into them. Because if our marriage is, you know, struggling or lacking, we're not going to have much to pour into them as a couple. And so the more we prioritize that, so, you know, they get so in their feelings like, what, y'all are going to Mexico, or y'all going to Florida without us? Yes, we are. Yes. We want you all to see mommy and daddy prioritizing our marriage and spending that time, you know, that time together. So,
So we're going to wrap up soon, but I want to kind of throw out maybe a couple of maybe boundary titles, and you guys take like a couple of seconds to say what's a great way to look at that. So a boundary title would be something like boundaries with the in-laws. What would be some things you suggest to some couples?
I would say boundaries with in-laws would be more so of, you know, how you run your home. You know, because growing up with your parents or parent, they ran their home how they wanted to. But as adults, and definitely being in your marriage, you decide for yourselves how you want to run your home. And sometimes when parents come, they may say, oh, well, you guys are doing this. You didn't do this when, you know, you weren't allowed to do this when we were, well, this is different. This is how we're choosing to run our home. So I would say boundaries with how you decide to run your household.
Awesome. Boundaries with work. How would you suggest people attack those boundaries?
I would definitely say write a list of what your priority is right now. And if you're writing down that your priority is family, children, self-care, whatever that is, then you need to always kind of compare and say, I've gotten this opportunity, but is this going to take away? Am I going to have to say no to my children in order to take on this work assignment? Am I going to have to say no to my self-care? Am I going to have to say no to my husband or my marriage? And so I think it's important to not only vocalize your priorities, but write them down so that you can remember those and keep that as the big picture at the forefront. And so I think that would be a good one.
Here's a one that I wouldn't mind chiming in is boundaries with church. And I know that a lot of times we feel like if we're giving so much of ourselves to church, that means we're giving to, Christ and allowing him to use us. But sometimes you can cross boundaries when you're spending way too much time prioritizing things that are actually at the actual building and not enough time prioritizing what is going on in your home or at your marriage. So sometimes you got to be like, hey, maybe I can't be there every single day of the week. Maybe we need to take a moment, or maybe we need to take a church day off and spend some time together, kind of rebuilding and reworking. So that would be a great, I hope you guys agree, a great boundaries with church going.
Definitely.
Sometimes it's necessary to do that. So I always love these wise panels where we can all agree, and I'm actually kind of interested to see where the men are going to go with this boundaries thing. So we are kicking it back to the men. It is on you, babe.
Thank you, ladies. Interesting conversation on boundaries. Today I have Malcolm and Pastor Snell with me today, and we just want to get it started. The ladies had their opinion, but the real opinion comes with the guys.
There we go.
That's
So
it.
just talking about boundaries. Malcolm, why do we need them?
Ooh, why do we need them? That's a great question. Why do we need boundaries? I think we need boundaries to survive.
Yeah.
Really, and
Survival tactic.
Survival. I could just stop it at that, because you could just put so much with that. But just to survive, we need boundaries.
Well, Pastor, I know earlier you were talking about boundaries and that connotation that often is negative with it. But what are some of the things that you think are positive impacts of having boundaries in a marriage specifically?
I ain't gonna lie, just even as a pastor, one of the benefits of boundaries is I think it just kills a lot of drama. So it's funny how the Bible says to avoid even the appearance of evil. So let's just say, you kind of have situations where, husband goes out to eat with female coworker. Then girlfriend of husband's wife sees him at lunch with female coworker, again, goes and calls. And now, again, he's got an issue at home, even if the lunch or the dinner was relatively platonic, harmless, so on and so forth. What happens is because, again, he didn't avoid the appearance. I'm not saying he did anything wrong, but it just looks a certain way. And see, now he's got to go home and answer for something simply because, perhaps a boundary was not put in place. And so I just think sometimes there is drama that is killed simply when you know where to be and where not to be. And I think one of the things that's exhausting in marriage is when you're answering for things that you didn't even do wrong, simply because you didn't really know how to manage kind of the optics of things. So I think one of the things it does is it just kills drama. It doesn't just keep you from temptation. I just think, it minimizes arguments and fights and unnecessary suspicions.
Makes sense. So just playing off of that. So what do you think about boundaries in friendships? Can you have work husbands, work spouses, work wives, healthy flirtation?
Well, now that doesn't work for me. Well, at least my wife only has one husband, and he goes across the board. So, at the end of the day, I think we have, I have female friends. My wife has male friends. But I think one of the things that happens, I actually think in marriage is that, it's interesting the dynamics that taking place. So even my female friends that I had before I married Gianna, there were some of them that kind of drifted off just by space and time, so on and so forth. But the ones that really continued, they actually connect stronger with Gianna now than they do with me. They're actually more her friends than mine. And kind of the opposite is too, where like if they're, were male friends, like they bond and connect with me, kind of a little bit more so now. And so I think that, friendships are permissible, but I think, again, for us, and it's just speaking for us, I think we tend to kind of do that more so in group settings as opposed to individually. And that's just kind of one of the things that we do to kind of manage the optics of things and to just kind of guard against the unseen. And I just think even as it relates to the issue of flirtation, to each his own, I just tend to err on the side of caution with that kind of thing. Because one of the things about flirtation, and we talked about earlier, chemistry is it's a thing.
Yeah.
You know, you don't really know kind of how people are going to receive a certain thing. So I try to do, you know, my best to kind of manage conversations so that nothing can be taken out of context, nothing can be misunderstood. And so I just think that, you know, I'm probably going to err on the side of caution as it relates to that.
And that sounds healthier for the marriage overall.
Yeah.
Just as a sidebar, that's a no for healthy flirtation.
And you don't speak alone with that. I know you said I might speak for myself, but that is how the marriage should work. Like what you said. Her male friends become your friends, your female friends more so become her female friends.
And I actually think that's kind of a telltale sign.
Yeah.
So that if your male friends can't really vibe with your husband or they choose not to, there's a problem. If those female friends can't really show respect or they only want to be around when your wife is not around, I think that actually speaks volumes. And so I just think that you want to just kind of operate in that safe space.
Yeah, and you brought up a good topic, segue into respect. Like one of the things that I remember having to do is setting expectations among my male friends. Like, yo, you can't call the house at 2 a.m. like we used to. We're not single anymore. I have kids. I have a wife at home. Or those type of things. Or we're not going out to single places because we're married and it's just nothing good is going to happen there. So setting boundaries and those expectations and making sure that your own friends have a respect for your household is, in our household, one of those things, those boundaries we set. Malcolm, let me ask you, what do you think is the difference between a boundary and an ultimatum?
Well, you know, humanly speaking, we break both, you know. And usually with the ultimatum, we're coming, it's my way or no way. But boundaries, especially in a marriage, are agreed upon. So when we agree upon these boundaries and we say, hey, for the sake of our relationship, let's set this hedge about ourselves so that we can stay together for one thing, then we can protect each other, and then those outside forces can't hurt us, whatever those outside forces are. And I think we really get it confused, and I feel like an ultimatum is more from a selfish standpoint. And then a boundary is more so a collective agreement that we make. You know, even with the NBA, how they, sports teams, when they talk about the collective bargaining agreement, they set a boundary.
They set a boundary. All right, we see you, Malcolm. We see you, Malcolm. You know, preach to us, Doc.
They set a boundary to make things work. So that's the way I see it for ourselves. Ultimatum, selfish, boundary.
And if I could just maybe add a little to that, I think boundaries are proactive. Ultimatums are reactive. They're acts of desperation. It's really kind of when a person that really doesn't know what else to do. That's when you begin to venture over into ultimatum land, just because there's not been a proactive measure in place to be able to deal with that particular situation. But PJ, the other thing I just want to throw in, when you talk about boundaries with friends, so it is the obligation of that husband to set the boundary with friends. In other words, like the wife should never have to answer or say to your friends, all right, this is when you can call, this is when you can come by, or you can't do this when you come, so on and so forth. And same thing with wife and her friends. I don't think that's ever the husband's responsibility to have to kind of put her friends in place or interface with them in that way. I think each and every person has to set that boundary for those friends and those who are outside of the relationship.
Would you take that same perspective when it comes to family? Because, you know, sometimes you have those meddling family members that are in there sometimes, and you're just like, as a husband, should I be the one that sets the missus' families in place, or should that be her job and the same for me? Do we manage it that way?
I feel like, you know, that's something, especially in a marital union, we come together and we decide how we're going to handle mom and dad, or even if you have a single parent, you know, this is how we should do it, right? And then agree upon it, because usually your family, they don't see boundaries.
That's how family is. We came up together, we hit it together, we know each other, so on and so forth. But I do think that principle kind of overlaps the family. So by and large, you know, I mean, our family is very blessed. We're blessed, and our families are very respectful of our marriage. It's never really been an issue. But if there were, you know, let's just say my brothers or siblings or cousins, I would never put that on Gianna to have to deal with them. That would be my responsibility to do that, and vice versa. But again, I think to Malcolm's point, we agree. We have an approach. All right, this is the order of our home. It's funny because that's one of the lasting messages from childhood. My dad saying, listen, no matter what, You don't let anybody come from the outside
Keep it in the
and
house.
dictate the order of your home. And it's crazy. He says, don't even let me do that.
Wow.
That's one of the things he even said. Not that it was something that he would ever even have the mind to do, but he said he just laid it out. And so that was just kind of one of those lessons. I saw it modeled. And so in some ways, it was kind of second nature to kind of put those things in place proactively so that you shouldn't even really have to be dealing with that 10, 15, 20 years into your marriage. That has to be a conversation in some ways before we get married. Hey, brothers, sibling, sometimes, especially when there is a single mom and a son who is getting married, there's a unique bond that is there. And there have to be some things that he kind of communicates to mom to kind of make sure things are in place so that it doesn't harm things going forward.
Yeah.
So making sure that you do it early on and not come back 10 years later. Well, this is my boundary. You know, that can cause problems.
And they like, it ain't been no problem all this time. All of a sudden, what's the issue?
Right.
So
right. That makes sense.
Yes.
Well, as we wrap up, if you had one thing to leave for our married couples out there, Malcolm, what would you say on this topic?
You know, I would say patience. You know, especially when it comes to boundaries, you exercise patience with each other because we're learning each other along the way. I mean, I've got 25 years into my marriage, but there's some pages that we turn that we haven't read together. So, you know, if we exercise patience, and of course, there's some boundaries that you got to have immediately. You know, you just can't. You just got to use some education too as well. But I would say patience to our married couples. Be patient with each other and work those boundaries out together.
Pastor?
I guess the other thing I'd probably add is that boundaries are not for weak people. Boundaries are for strong people. Like Jesus said, man, I mean, he just laid out in Matthew 26, he says, man, be careful that you enter not into temptation, because the spirit is willing, but the flesh indeed is weak.
That's the word.
Like Jesus laid it out. I mean, and we sit here doing our best as men of God, but we are men. Like, I mean, we're men. Like, this flesh is faulty, it's fallen. And so we have to just kind of put some things in place, not because we're weak or something's wrong or vulnerable or because you're doing the wrong thing. It's like recognizing that, okay, man, you know, I recognize what I'm up against. I realize, man, it's crazy. You know, everywhere you turn, there is an assault on male eyes, like on television and media. So we have to kind of put some things in place that, you know, kind of help us stay on the path that ultimately leads to the wholeness of the marriage, that keeps us from destroying the witness of our marriage and just kind of allows us to get to a place where the things that we value are never, you know, put in a vulnerable space. And so it's not for weak men or weak women. It's for strong people who recognize that we're fallen and all of us are susceptible.
That's right.
Thank you, gentlemen, for sharing, and we're going to kick it back over to you, Danita.
Listen, you kicked it back to me, and here you are standing right here.
It's magic, baby.
Listen, we hope you enjoyed this episode today. We want to encourage you to help us continue providing programming like this. And there are 5 ways to give here at Breath of Life. The first way is online at breathoflife.tv.
The second way is by mail at Breath of Life, P.O. Box 5960, Huntsville, Alabama 35814.
Or you can call us at 256-929-6460.
Text the phrase "Give to BOL TV" to 188-364-GIVE.
Or you can hit our Cash App at $BreathofLifeTV. With all of those different ways to give, we encourage you to donate so that we can continue providing program, not just like POV, but like next week when we do another scripture lab with Pastor Snell. Until then, thank you for watching. This is your Breath of Life.
Yeah.